Chapter 11. Michael. Needle in a haystack. As Jonah lay asleep, I picked up his British passport and folded it open. The identity of the carrier was marked as Jonah Badmus. Badmus rather than Echo, which was a conscious decision he had made to retain the name of our biological father, a man we had never met. There's no reason to change my surname if I don't have to, he had said to Mr. and Mrs. Echo when he was 10. 10 years old and already displaying the ability to be short and decisive. I gazed at the passport photograph and observed Jonah's fixed and expressionless face staring back at me. Then I dumped the passport back on the bed and felt the vibration of my mobile phone. It was a text message. Good evening, Mr. Echo. I hope you're well. Following a brief investigation into your recent request, I have found some crucial information that I'm keen on sharing with you. I'll be in my office from 9 a.m. tomorrow morning and will appreciate it if you could stop by to discuss the matter further. Shade Nonso, Private Investigator, Moonlight Investigations, Lagos, 14 Allen Avenue, Lagos City. I stared at the screen. For a moment I was convinced she had made some mistake. Otherwise the agency's efficiency had to be absurd. 9 o'clock the next morning, I thought. I continued to gaze at the screen of the handset, utterly amazed that in less than 24 hours a Sherlock Holmes-type investigator may have just found a link to whoever was driving on the morning my parents were killed. I perused the message again with mixed emotions, unsure if I was looking at a scam or the unlikely scenario of a needle being found in a haystack. I remembered Jonah's words of just a few minutes earlier, a prudent piece of advice. He had spoken of the danger of being taken for every penny I had. However, the response I had given to him was the decision that I was still determined to maintain. Who dares wins. Scribbling down the address of the agency on a piece of paper, I had a quick shower and got dressed. A short while later, I grabbed a cab. But as I climbed into the back seat, I discovered I had left the paper behind. Just when I thought I would have to return to my room, I remembered the information was still on my phone and read the details to the driver. A good half hour later, we pulled up outside a 4-story office building in the middle of a gated compound. The building, like several others I had spotted along the way, had a good number of external defects and was well overdue for some structural repair and a major paint job. A large wooden board with a chalked message, "No taxis or Okada motorcycles," was attached to a manually operated sliding gate. After paying the driver, I climbed out of the car and accessed the premises through a side entrance. A uniformed guard was seated in a tiny office outdoors. Displaying a sad pair of eyes, he glanced up from a newspaper as I walked past. "Welcome, sir," he said, and carried on reading. Several corporately dressed men and women slipped in and out of the building's front entrance. Cars were parked at random. Strolling through an open set of double doors, I found myself in a dimly lit lobby. There was no one at the reception desk, only a lady's handbag dumped on a seat behind it. Mounted on the wall was a giant board with the names of companies and their designated floors in magnetic letters. Moonlight Investigations Lagos was on the 3rd floor. With no service elevator in sight, I jogged up a dusty stairwell and arrived on the 3rd floor. Walking down a narrow corridor, I went past the doors of some of the companies advertised out front. Then I stopped before a windowless office. The investigation agency's name was fixed across the door in brass letters. I knocked twice, and a voice on the other side said, "Come in." I opened the door and stepped into a pristine, fluorescent-lit, air-conditioned room. The lady known as Sade Nonso was seated behind a glass office desk, a wooden cabinet parked beneath it. Remembering the photograph I'd seen of her earlier, she was even more attractive in the flesh. Sade had 4 items laid out before her: a vase of roses, a graduation picture, an A4-sized, official-looking brown envelope, and an Apple Mac laptop. She rose to her feet as I closed the door and made my approach. "Mr. Echo?" "Michael will do." She stuck out an eager hand. "Happy you could make it, Michael." She had a glorious smile. I took her hand in mine and shook it. It felt soft and tender, like the hand of a defenseless infant. "Please have a seat," she gestured to a leather chair across from her. I sat down and scanned the room. It was spacious and had cream-coloured walls matching marble floor tiles of the same colour. At the far end of the room was a leather couch. A few feet from the sofa, a Persian rug was balanced upright in a quiet corner. The rug looked new, still embalmed in plastic, good and ready to grace the middle of the floor. Right behind me, to the left of the door, was a sign I had noticed on my way in. A giant glass-framed sign which read "Moonlight Investigations Lagos" in bold, glossy letters. "Can I get you anything?" Sade said, making for an open door at the back of the room. "No, I'm fine." "You sure? Water? Juice?" Then with a humorous smile, "Cup of tea?" I smiled at her last offer. "A bottle of water will do," I said. "Way too hot for tea." She disappeared into a room I assumed was a kitchen and returned with a bottle of Evian water. Planting the bottle on the desk before me, she reclaimed her seat. I twisted open the lid and took a swig. I placed the bottle back on the desk. "You do this alone?" I said. "Just me, myself, and I." "Hard work?" "Wouldn't have it any other way." I nodded, a little anxious about whatever it was she had to share. I glanced over at the rug again. "Beautiful rug," I said, stalling the conversation for a minute. She looked over at the item and smiled. "It is, isn't it?" she said, as though noticing it for the first time herself. Still trying to figure out if it's the right fit for this office, though. I shifted my gaze in the direction of the rug once again. "Whatever you decide, I think it looks pretty stunning." She smiled back in appreciation. "Thank you, Michael." She snatched up the brown envelope and withdrew an official-looking form from inside. She flashed the form at me. "Now onto the good stuff," she said, and slid the document across the table. She gestured to the seat with an open hand. "Something for you to sign before we talk." "What's this?" I said, a little baffled. "Confidentiality clause," she said, and extended me a pen. "What for?" "Protection. Mine and yours. The agreement states that though you can use the information I'm about to share with you in whichever way you choose, you can never reveal how you obtained it." Meaning I can never... She didn't let me finish. "Mention either the name of myself or this company." "How much is this going to cost?" "The service or a lawsuit?" I smiled in return. "The service." 20,000 naira, she replied. I stared at her in disbelief. £20? Too much? Thought it would cost more. "Good," she said. Believe it or not, I was never in it for the money. I acknowledged her honesty with a nod, reached into my pocket and pulled out a wallet. "Not yet," she said. "I'm sorry?" "You've forgotten something." She jabbed a finger at the agreement. I forced a smile. "Bit too eager," I said, in a self-deprecatory tone. I picked up the document and whizzed through the main details. Ignoring the small print, I signed and printed my name across a dotted line. She reached over and retrieved the document. "Now you can pay me," she said. I fished a couple of £20 notes from the wallet and showed them to her. "You don't mind sterling, do you?" I said. "Not in the slightest." I slid the notes across the table. You can keep the change. She had pushed the money to one side, like the insignificant piece of a puzzle, and shunted a pen and a white piece of paper beneath my nose. I have a name and an address for you. She paused for a spell and pointed at the paper. You have to write it down, she said. I nodded enthusiastically and listened carefully as she mentioned the name of the driver and shared an address which she believed was his place of residence. Scribbling down the information, I stared at the man's name and a cloud of anger rose up inside me. He's the son of a prominent government official, she said, so having an arrest or a confession isn't going to be a walk in the park. Are you telling me this bastard is untouchable? Was. Right now, his father is in prison for embezzlement, meaning his influence will be nothing close to what it used to be. I said nothing in return. Then I felt the warmth of her hand slip over mine in a comforting gesture. There's only one way to go about this, and that's by using the law. She paused a beat. It will probably cost you a bit, but for the right price you stand a decent chance of getting a result. She looked uncomfortable and the proverbial penny dropped. This was Lagos. The only way of persuading a corrupt police officer to get off their backsides was to grease their oily palms. A short while later, I was headed back to the hotel in another yellow cab. Having acquired the driver's name and address, I could feel the adrenaline rush flush through my veins. I was within touching distance of achieving justice for the crime that had brought the lives of my parents to a premature end. Then, an identified number silently flashed up on my mobile phone. I answered it. Hello, I said. Are you the one they call Michael? Who wants to know? I have an urgent message for him, sir. I paused for a moment. Michael speaking. Good, the caller returned. My name is Sergeant Arinze. We have met before. I remembered the name instantly, Sergeant Winston Arinze, one of the 3 police officers who had conned me out of £40 after accompanying Uncle Taffy and myself to the crash site. I cringed at the sound of his voice. It reminded me of an unscrupulous used car salesman. I remember you, I said irritably. You and your buddies left me £40 short. Please don't be annoyed, he replied in a weary tone. Lagos life is complicated. Anyway, that is not what I'm calling about. I'm listening. The officer you were looking for the other day wants to meet with you. I felt as though I'd been shot with a taser gun. Excuse me? Inspector Phoenix Balogun. But yes, I know, he interjected. For security reasons, we had to tell you we did not know him. Forgive me if I find that pretty hard to believe, I said. This is no time for arguments, sir. Can you make it? When? Today. What time? He will be here in half an hour. You remember the address? I asked for it again and put the phone on speaker for the driver to hear. After Sergeant Arinze had finished, he said, "See you soon," and the line went dead. I glanced at my watch. Think we can make it there in 30 minutes? I asked the driver. 20 south. We go follow shortcut. I nodded and smiled to myself. The pieces were finally beginning to take shape. I had a name, an address, and was now 30 minutes away from meeting a man I hoped would help ensure justice was done. My mind went to Jonah again. He was smart, dominant, and intuitive, but on this occasion, wrong. Chapter 12. An officer, not a gentleman. Inspector Phoenix Balogun stood before a full-length bedside mirror and buttoned up his police tunic, which concealed the bulletproof vest he had worn each day for over 10 years. Satisfied, he stared down at the 25-year-old sex worker with whom he had just spent the last half hour. The woman was naked and lying in a fetal position, her arms curled around a pillow. But this was nothing new to Balogun. He was a frequent patron at her place of business and all too familiar with the game she was playing. Part of a local brothel, the room was being rented as a location from which this young lady could practice her chosen trade and have a place to stay. Illuminated by the crimson glow of a red-colored bulb which hung from the ceiling, the room was tiny but adequately equipped for the job. A double bed took up the majority of the room's floor space, and a ceiling fan was on full blast. A medium-sized flat-screen television stood on a stand fitted with a couple of shelves. Stacked on the top shelf was a DVD player. On the one below, a number of adult discs for anyone requiring a little incentive. 50 years of age, Balogun stood a mere 5 feet 7 inches, a barrel chest, arms the size of boulders, and thighs built like tree trunks gave him a physical presence that was impossible to ignore. However, to the discerning eye, the officer's persistent application of bleaching creams to lighten what was once a dark complexion was evidence of a deep-bred insecurity. An insecurity a psychologist might link to the crisis of identity of a man who had never known his biological father, and, like the lady before him, one who had been raised by a woman who had also been a full-time practitioner of the oldest profession in the world. Balogun gazed at the woman again. Appearing exhausted at the end of a session was aimed at boosting the client's ego in hope of a higher fee than the one initially agreed. The woman, possessing a face of virginal innocence and a body built for seduction, could use this strategy effectively on most men, just not him. Counting a handful of notes from his pocket, he dumped the cash on the bed. As though on cue, the woman battered open an eyelid. "No, Jara," she said in broken English, a dejected tone to her voice. "Next time," Balogun said. She sat upright and gathered the cash together. "It's not good, oh. You never give me anything extra." He looked at her again. She had the animal attraction his ex-wife had never possessed, and had given him the kind of pleasure she was never able to fulfill. But he was an officer, not a gentleman. "I said next time." He yanked open the door and marched out of the room. Closing the door behind him, Balogun turned left and proceeded to walk down a corridor illuminated by a red glow. Heading past several rooms, Balogun sauntered through an open archway that connected with a large lounge which had a bar and a restaurant service area. It was mid-afternoon, and the broad windows on either side of the room were wide open, flooding the space with natural daylight. A pleasant draft swept through the room, a combination of cross-ventilation and 2 ceiling fans on full power. Several male customers were seated at tables around the room. They were enjoying bottles of beer and eating delectable dishes of grilled fish, fried snails, and bowls of pepper soup. Some of the men were already in the company of women for hire, while others seemed to be saving the action for later. At the back of the room were a couple of comfortable-looking sofas. Balogun sank into one of them. He beckoned to the waiter from the bar, who scurried over to attend to him. "Oga, I saluto," the waiter said deferentially, bouncing the flat of his hand off the top of his forehead like a military officer. "Give me a bottle of Star," Balogun said. Any fried goat, fish, pepper soup? The waiter asked with dedicated enthusiasm. Maybe later. The waiter disappeared for a few moments and returned with a frozen-looking bottle of Star beer and a tall glass on a tray. Placing the items on a bar stool, he popped off the lid of the beer bottle. Ice cold, sir, he said. Just how you prefer it. Good man. Balogun took a swig from the bottle and savored the bitter taste as it melted the dryness of his throat and settled into the pit of his stomach. He smiled to himself, enjoying the smooth texture of one of the nation's oldest and most enduring alcoholic beverages. Half an hour later, the bottle was empty, and he was about to draw the attention of the waiter for another when he heard a commotion from the other side of the room. Balogun's combat instincts kicked in immediately. His eyes scanned the room and identified a casually dressed man seated across from the same sex worker he had paid off a short while ago. Physically speaking, the man was enormous and looked capable of creating a world of trouble. However, on closer inspection, Balogun could also tell there was something unusual about him, starting with his eyes, or rather, the direction in which they were looking. Turning to see what the man, and everyone else for that matter, was staring at, Balogun immediately spotted where the disturbance was coming from. Over in a far corner, a couple of inebriated men were standing across from each other at a busy table. The men were screaming at each other in what looked like a drunken standoff, while a hired girl frantically tried to ease the commotion. In a blind rage, one of the men snapped up an empty beer bottle from the table. As though to prove a point, he smashed it over his own head. Balogun rose silently from the couch and marched over to the men's table. But it didn't stop. He walked right past them and headed out of the front door. It was apparent that neither man had noticed him, but for Balogun this was irrelevant. He was an officer of the law, and the actions of both men constituted a significant level of disrespect. More importantly, the situation was a window of opportunity, an opportunity to make a ton of cash, but the insult would have to be addressed first. As Balogun exited the building, he headed over to a Hilux pickup truck marked police. He reached into the vehicle's open-ended compartment and snatched up a tasseled horsewhip, popularly known as a koboko. Holding the koboko in his right hand, a call came through on his mobile phone. Balogun fished the handset out from his pocket with his left and answered it. Rambo, the voice on the other end said, addressing Balogun by the nickname he had answered to for over a decade. How far? Balogun said. The man from London is here, the voice returned. Balogun smiled. Give me half an hour, he said, and rolling his neck like a prime Mike Tyson, walked back into the bar. Chapter 13. Juku. The driver of the fast-moving Range Rover had the pedal to the floor and showed no signs of letting up. At 6 a.m, it was at least an hour since first light, and Simon Juku was returning from another all-nighter at a random selected night spot. All 4 windows of the motor vehicle were wound down, allowing a flood of moist, fresh-smelling air to sweep through the interior of the cabin and hit him flush in the face. An added buzz to what was already a drug and alcohol-induced high. In the back seat, the beautiful, caramel-complexioned female he had picked up half an hour earlier had fallen asleep. Picking up a whiff of her clean-smelling fragrance, he gazed at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. She was kitted out in a crop top and a tiny miniskirt. She couldn't have been more than 20 years of age. Allowing his gaze to linger on a pair of legs which ran for miles and perfectly manicured feet in platform-style sandals, Juku felt a lump of desire rise in his throat. She was probably a university student, he thought. Another girl in some nearby campus who would willingly trade her body for the opportunity to afford a decent education. He smiled to himself at the ultimate thrill of it all. Being the only son of a former Southern state governor, the 35-year-old was no stranger to a life of money, recreational drugs, and sexual excess. During his father's 8-year reign, he had carte blanche to do whatever he pleased. However, since the governor's arrest and 15-year sentence for financial embezzlement, those days were long gone. Karma was a bitch, he had often heard people say. But this didn't change the fact he was bitter about his loss of status and furious that he had been made a social pariah by those within the government's elite circles who had severed ties with him for fear of being exposed themselves. But old habits die slowly. Though the social privileges Juku had once enjoyed were now gone, his addiction to alcohol, cocaine, and sexual gratification had shown no signs of dissipating. At a mere 5 feet, 6 inches, Juku had always been insecure about his height. He was also in poor health, an asthma sufferer since birth, and embodied a fragile physique which resembled that of a prepubescent youngster. However, irrespective of these physical deficits, the ominous presence of his bodyguard, who sat in the front passenger seat of the motor vehicle, gave him little cause to concern himself about self-defense. His name was Eminike, a man-mountain who at 6 foot 9 inches weighed something in the region of 300 pounds. At age 28, Eminike had been in Juku's employ for 7 years. Dwarfing everyone he met, the giant was once described as having the type of aura that calcified the blood of grown men. At a single glance, the bodyguard's role was self-explanatory. However, on the rare occasion he encountered someone who needed to be reminded, he ensured that the damage left behind would leave others with no doubt. An example of such brutality had occurred only a couple of weeks earlier and involved 5 heavily built doormen who had refused Juku entry to a prominent nightclub. A brazen insult in Juku's view, but an insult Eminike had corrected in the space of 10 minutes. 10 minutes of chaos that had resulted in the hospitalization of all 5 men, who were left with a combination of broken ribs, cracked skulls, and shattered jaws. 5 men who at best would forever need support for life-altering injuries. It was a chilling reminder of Eminike's brute strength, animal-like savagery, and unquestionable loyalty, but also a performance that would open the door to an offer Juku would find too lucrative to refuse. The visit was unannounced and came a week later, a visit to Juku's home in the city of Abuja from a stranger he had never met, an elderly-looking man who seemed powerful and well-connected. A man in his early 70s who was dressed from head to toe in white, a white safari suit matched with a large white Stetson hat, like a Texan oil merchant. The visitor's physical makeup was also unique, a bloated, tribal-marked face and a skeletal frame. More extraordinary still was how in a country whose citizens continued to have an inferiority complex around foreigners, the man's driver was a Caucasian man in his 50s, a silent employee who looked like he worked for the Queen of England. The visitor's offer was direct: £50,000 in exchange for Emenike's services. A generous proposal which, if declined, would automatically become a demand. The reason for this was simple. On the night the giant had destroyed any chance of a healthy future for the 5 doormen, he had scuppered a crucial investment. A significant investment which had involved ready-made plans for these men to participate in a contest the visitor had described as the Squared Circle in the United Kingdom. An underground fight competition matching the best against the best. A contest in which Emenike would now be required to become a participant. As the needle of the Range Rover edged past 100 kilometers per hour, Juku smiled at the thought of the amount he was to receive in the next few days. He had no doubts that the man in the white hat, who had not shared his name, was a person of significant influence, and decided that this was no time to make enemies. He was also confident that he would have no difficulty in securing Emenike's cooperation, and decided he would compensate him with a payment of £500. A minuscule figure next to what was being offered, but for a man who had never shown any interest in money, likely to be sufficient. The smile on Juku's face broadened. He had been running short of cash for several weeks, but the next 6 months would be a return to form. A time to step up his game, as the Americans like to say. Cristal rather than Moet, women from foreign countries rather than university students looking to pay their next tuition, and an unbridled consumption of the purest cocaine on the market. £50,000, a fat packet of cash that Juku was sure would be gone in 3 months. He had no plans after that, but decided that was a bridge better crossed when he got there. As the speed of the car continued to climb, Juku swept around a sharp curve, and the vehicle's headlights illuminated a massive pothole. The pothole couldn't have been less than a foot wide, but was about 2 feet deep, like a chunk of road that had been ripped out by a tractor. In a bid to avert imminent disaster, Juku spun the steering wheel 90 degrees to the right and slammed his foot down on the brake pedal, a combination of actions which, at the speed the car was traveling, was as pointless as the Titanic's attempt to avoid the iceberg. There was a deafening bang, and the car's front right tire smashed into the pothole. The girl in the rear seat was thrown sideways. She ricocheted off the passenger door and released a horrific scream. At the same time, the car bounced into the air, and for a split second, tipped onto 2 tires, like a flamboyant stunt from an 80s James Bond flick. Then as the vehicle crashed back to earth, it veered violently off the motorway and illuminated another obstacle in its path. 2 obstacles, to be precise. 2 lives, a man and a woman. The pair were elderly and were standing in a remote clearing off the side of the road. The man was standing beside a Peugeot and seemed to be on the verge of changing a flat tire, while the woman, standing several feet away, was punching the keypad of a mobile phone and had her back turned. Juku's foot remained flattened against the brake pedal, an instinctive but futile action, and he knew it. The rigid look of horror on the old man's face made it apparent he knew it too. Knew there was no escape, and death, at least for his partner, was all but guaranteed. Then the man did something extraordinary. With the agility of a 25-year-old, he dashed over to the woman and embraced her from behind, an instinctive reaction which appeared to be a desperate attempt to prevent her pivoting around and witnessing what was to be a most violent end to her and now both their lives. As the vehicle collided with the couple, their bodies were thrown up against the windscreen and sent toppling over the roof of the car. At that moment, Juka realized his life had taken a dramatic and potentially irreversible turn. Chapter 14. Jonah. Rambo. I woke up in a heavy sweat and glanced at my watch. It was 2 o'clock. 2 in the afternoon, meaning I'd been dead to the world for the better part of 8 hours, and for the suffocating heat would probably have stayed that way. I sat upright, wiped the perspiration off my brow with the back of my forearm and looked around the room. There was no sign of Michael. After our brief conversation, it was clear he had made his mind up about what he was going to do and was not about to be convinced otherwise. Stifling a wide yawn with a clenched fist, it wasn't just the heat that was apparent, but the empty silence in place of the loud air conditioning unit which had greeted me upon my arrival. Springing to my feet, I snapped on a light switch, but got no response from the single bulb that dangled from the ceiling. Then I went over to the door, yanked it open, and stepped out into the corridor. It was dead quiet. Heading down to the lobby, I arrived at the front desk. A uniformed male member of staff sat there wearing a pair of large counterfeit-looking Beats branded headphones. The man was listening to something on a tired-looking smartphone. He didn't appear to hear me approach. Rapping on the desk with my knuckles, he glanced up. Startled, he whipped off the headphones in the manner of a schoolboy caught napping in class. "Oga, welcome," he said. "What happened to the power?" I asked. "NEPA." Meaning? National Electric Power Authority. This is how they do things here. It has been 4 days now. 4 days of what? No lights. How about this morning? Nah, generator, he said, with what appeared to be a whiff of pride. Why isn't it on now? Diesel. Diesel costs too much, but please just manage for now, sir. From 7 o'clock this evening, everything will be back to normal. 24-hour power? The generator, sir, he emphasized. Management will make sure they have it running again. For how long? Till about 9 o'clock in the morning, the following morning. I said nothing in return. The message was crystal. No power for the next 8 hours unless the power company NEPA did something about it. And from all indications, the odds of that happening were slim to none. I glanced across the lobby and saw a room marked by a metal-plated sign overhead that read Drinks Bar. The letter D in drinks was missing and left only an indented impression. I sauntered over, keen on grabbing a cold drink to combat the stifling heat. In the center of the room, 3 circular-shaped wooden tables were covered in cheap-looking plastic tablecloths. Tucked beneath each table were a couple of creaky-looking wooden chairs. Glancing across the room, I spotted another male staff member. Seated on a stool, he was enjoying an extended nap behind a service counter, one side of his face lying flat against the counter's surface. In the background, a tall refrigerator stood beside a row of empty wall shelves. Crossing over to the man, I repeated what I'd done with his colleague and rapped my knuckles on the counter. He awoke with a start. "Afternoon, star," "Sir," he said, bolting upright. "Got any drinks?" I said. "What do you need?" "A large Guinness." "No problem." He bounced off his stool and yanked open the fridge. He extracted a large bottle of Guinness and slid it across the counter. The bottle looked dead dry, and as I closed my fist around it, felt warm to the touch. As the bartender produced a bottle opener, I raised a palm in protest. "Nothing cold?" I said. "Oh, guys, sorry there's been..." I didn't let him finish. "No power for 4 days, just got the memo." "Memo?" "Information." "Oh, now I get you," he said. He paused for a moment, and his voice dropped to a whisper, like a person who was about to reveal some classified information. "But I can show you somewhere I can get a cold drink." "Yes," and he paused for another spell. "Anything else you might need?" I gave him a quizzical look and noticed the smirk on his face, which was when the penny dropped. "Anything else you might need?" Coded language for the opposite sex. "Give me 15 minutes, I said. Returning to the hotel room, I had a quick shower and slipped on a fresh t-shirt. The bartender, who said his name was Tunde, had a cab waiting outside. He was sitting in the front passenger seat and turned around as I climbed in the back. "Oga, I hope you don't mind if I show you the place," he said. "That's fine." Half an hour later, the taxi cab pulled into the courtyard of a large drinking establishment. There was a huge sign above the front entrance which read, "Cool Breeze." As we climbed out of the car, Tunde instructed the cabman to wait and accompanied me into the bar. A spacious venue. Groups of people were seated at large circular tables, knocking back drinks and enjoying exotic-looking meat and fish dishes. Afrobeat music played softly in the background, softly for now, though likely to become louder as evening approached, and there was an uptake in foot traffic. A number of scantily clad women occupied the room, sex workers, as the PC Brigade would like to describe them. The bartender glanced up at me. "You like?" he asked. "Maybe after a drink," I replied. He nodded and went quiet for a spell. I got the message, flipped out my wallet, and handed him a £10 note. His eyes lit up in gratitude. "God bless you, sir." "Think you can pick me up later?" I replied. "What time?" I was about to answer when I noticed a stunning-looking female who was standing in a corner across the room. Wearing a tight-fitted outfit, her demeanor was calmer than that of her peers. She gazed in my direction and smiled. "Give me a couple of hours," I said. "Don't worry, sir. Long before that time, I'll be here waiting for you." He shot off, and I took a seat at a nearby table. A waiter scurried over. "What can I get you, Oga?" "A cold Guinness," I said. "Anything else?" A whiff of rich, delicious-smelling pastry swept across the room, and my head snapped around. A couple of tables from where I was sitting, a small group of people were being served a large tray of meat pies. I felt my mouth water and heard an empty growl from the pit of my stomach, which reminded me that I hadn't eaten for at least 7 hours. "Got any more of those pies?" I said, motioning to the table with a sideways jerk of my head. "Ah, we get them plenty, oh," the waiter said. "How many shall I bring for you?" I shot up 3 fingers. He nodded, and looking over my head, acknowledged someone behind me. "Sister, welcome, oh." I whipped around, and the working girl I'd seen earlier was standing right beside me. We traded a smile. "Anything else, sir?" I heard the waiter say. "Whatever the lady's having," I said. She took a seat across from me and looked up at the waiter. "Just a bottle of Fanta for now, Inamdi," she said. "Is that all?" I asked, granting her permission to ditch the modesty. Her smile broadened, and she looked up at the waiter again. "A plate of goat pepper soup." She turned back to me. "How are you?" she said. "We'll feel a lot better once those pies are inside me." "You sound like you live abroad." "I do." America? London. Oh, London, she sang. You are very fortunate. I have one auntie who lives there, but she does not want to send for me. I wouldn't take it personally. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. I don't understand. London's not all it's made out to be. I noticed a police officer sitting alone at the back of the room. He was short in stature and had the thick, sturdy physique of a professional wrestler. His eyes were cold and detached, his complexion visibly uneven, making it apparent, even from a distance, that his skin had been artificially lightened. The officer was drinking a beer, which I found odd for a man in uniform in public, but quickly reminded myself that this was the city of Lagos, not London. I heard the voice of the waiter once again. Your food, sir. I turned in his direction. The waiter was carrying a large tray loaded with everything we had ordered. He lowered onto the table a large plate of meat pies and a bunch of napkins. He did the same for the girl, sliding under her nose a hot bowl of pepper soup with 2 giant pieces of goat meat. Setting a couple of tall glasses on the table, a giant frosty bottle of Guinness and an equally chilled bottle of Fanta, he snapped open both lids and took his leave. Ignoring the glasses, I reached for the Guinness and took a satisfying swig. Using a fork, I cut a large chunk from one of the pies and shoveled it into my mouth. The taste was awesome. Better now? I heard the girl say. I looked up at her. She was sipping her drink with a straw like a teenager from the American Bandstand era. Getting there, I said. So what's your name? She asked. Jonah. You? Fumilayo. Bit of a mouthful. She smiled. Just call me Fumi, she said. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a pair of loud, angry voices from across the room. Turning in the direction of the disturbance, I clocked 2 inebriated men in a heated face-off. Engaged in a fiery exchange of words, the men were standing on opposite sides of a table, while a working girl who seemed to be the subject of the dispute made a futile effort to defuse the chaos. In a move I figured was meant to frighten his opponent, one of the men grabbed an empty bottle from the table and smashed it over his own head. The other man was unfazed and didn't budge an inch. However, someone else did. Bolting to his feet, the police officer I had observed earlier moved swiftly towards the incident. Marching straight past the men, he disappeared out of the front entrance. It was an odd response to a crisis by an officer of the law, but a reaction that appeared to be deliberate, which was confirmed when he returned with a horsewhip in his fist. Ambushing the men with ferocious savagery, the police officer tore into the unsuspecting pair, wailing on them at random. Howling in agony, both men threw up their hands in a defensive motion, but as the skin from their open palms was lacerated by an instrument designed to tame an animal weighing no less than 1,000 pounds, the man who took pride in owning a head built for obliterating beer bottles decided to take a stand. Grabbing hold of the officer's wrist, he made a desperate attempt to halt the action. A significant error of judgment which garnered an immediate consequence. Like a pit bull on steroids, the officer propelled himself forward, delivering an explosive headbutt which split the man's forehead and left a pool of blood streaming down his face. For a brief second, I felt an overwhelming urge to intervene and bring the assault to an abrupt close using my own brand of conflict resolution, but opted not to get involved for 3 reasons. First, it was merely an ass-kicking, not a murder. Second, the neutral expressions on the faces of the other patrons, and a quiet remark from a passing waiter who whispered, "Rambo, they deal with person again," made it clear that, like the power cuts from NEPA, this was not an isolated occurrence. The third, yet most crucial reason I opted to stay in my lane, as the Americans like to phrase it, was the sight of a service pistol tucked into the holster of the officer's belt. It was a semi-automatic 9mm Beretta, a powerful firearm which I was not about to take a bullet from for sticking my nose into a matter that had nothing to do with me. As the officer dragged both men out of the bar, I turned to Fumi and said, "Someone you know?" "Rambo," she answered. "Rambo? It's his nickname, like, you know, the famous movie star." "Sly Stallone?" She nodded, leaned across the table and lowered her voice. "But as you have just witnessed, he is nobody's hero." The next few minutes were spent in silence as we ate. Once we were finished, Fumi dabbed the corners of her mouth with a serviette and looked up at me. "Ready for me now?" she said. I drained the rest of my drink and shrugged my shoulders. "After you," I said, waving my hand away from the table. She took me by the hand and led me across the room and through an archway that connected with a walkway which led to the quarters where the women conducted their business. The walkway was illuminated by the crimson glow of a backstreet brothel. There were several rooms either side of the corridor. We walked past a few of them, and Fumi stopped before the one which belonged to her. "My room," she whispered, reaching into her bra and producing a single key. She unlocked the door, pushed it open, and waltzed into the room. I followed her inside and closed the door behind me. She slipped out of her dress. "Got any protection?" She stopped abruptly. "I thought you liked me." "Not that much." She smiled. With a masterful sleight of hand, she flashed a hidden condom at me. "Always," she said. I nodded and scanned the surroundings. The room was tiny and felt like being trapped in a phone booth. "Fancy going somewhere else?" I said. She stopped once again. "For the night?" "Pretty much." Her face split into a broad smile. "Let me pack my things." "I will be outside," I said. I returned to the bar and walked out of the front entrance where I found Tunde waiting. Sitting on the bonnet of the cab he had hired earlier, he was downing a beer and flirting with one of the working girls. The officer they called Rambo looked like he was having a pep talk with the two men he had physically assaulted. A remarkable turnaround in relations after what had been one of the most brutal physical attacks I'd ever witnessed. Each man extended a handful of banknotes to him. The officer received the cash with a smile and patted each of the men on the shoulder in an all's well that ends well fashion. He climbed behind the wheel of a Hilux pickup truck marked police and drove off. I watched the truck disappear in a cloud of dust with only one thought on my mind. The police officers in this city were more than just corrupt. They were dangerous. Exceedingly dangerous. Chapter 15. Michael. Every day for the thief. It took about 40 minutes to reach the police station I'd visited the previous day. I was told that Balogun was stuck in traffic and I was ushered into his office to wait. Taking a seat at the police officer's desk, I stared at the official nameplate, Inspector P. Balogun, a man who, less than 12 hours earlier, no one seemed to have any knowledge existed. There was a neat stack of half a week's worth of newspapers on one end of the desk and another organized pile of what looked like a bunch of untouched police files on the other. Unlike the rest of the police station, the office was comfortable and well maintained. There was the welcoming smell of freshly painted walls, clean wood effect laminate flooring, the pleasant feel of cold air from a wall-mounted air conditioning unit, and the convenience of a small fridge in one corner of the room. Reaching across the desk, I grabbed a newspaper from the top of the pile, today's Nigerian Observer. Dominating the front page was a bold headline, "Nigeria oil shortage, who to blame?" There was a photograph of a mass of frustrated-looking people and a lengthy queue of motor vehicles outside a petrol station. Then I heard the door open, and a loud voice bellowed across the room, "Welcome, my brother." I whipped around. A man I assumed was Inspector Balogun briskly crossed the room. He was light in complexion, short in stature, built like a mini-truck, and smelt like he had been swimming in a bathtub of cologne. He extended a hand. His grip was firm, his hand coarse and hard, which made the experience feel as though I was shaking the hand of a gorilla. "You're a hard man to get hold of." "This is Lagos," he replied, employing the popular phrase for justifying anything that was off-kilter. Batting a hand, he said, "Please sit." I lowered myself back into the seat. With a smile still carved on his face, Balogun headed over to the fridge, yanked it open, and extracted 2 bottles of beer. He clanked the bottles between the knuckles of his fingers, came back over and planted one of them on the desk. With a raised hand, I declined the offer. "Thanks, but I'm trying to cut back." "It will not kill you," he said, in a tone that appeared to suggest I had no choice in the matter. He produced a bunch of car keys which had a bottle opener and snapped the lid off the drink. Circling the desk, he took a seat across from me. He popped open his own bottle and took a swig. "You have to forgive my boys," he said, "but what they told you is true." He made an open-palmed gesture with both hands. "You see, I have plenty of enemies, so for security reasons, if anyone wishes to see me, we must first exercise caution." I nodded but was unconvinced by his explanation. "Guess you know why I'm here then?" He nodded solemnly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." He placed a palm to his chest in a heartfelt gesture. "But at the time I found your dear parents, there was nothing I could do." "I got a text message that morning," I said. "My mother must have just sent it before." I paused abruptly, took a deep breath. "Just before this bastard ran them over." Balogun nodded. He pulled out a drawer on his side of the desk and withdrew an item which he kept concealed in his palm. He slid the object across the table and removed his hand. It was a mobile phone with a cracked screen. "The mobile you called that morning," Balogun said. I picked up the handset that had belonged to my mother and, overcome with grief, cupped the phone with both hands like a precious stone, the tears welling up in my eyes and flowing freely down my cheeks. "When I heard it ring and saw your name, I was compelled to answer it," he said. I wiped away the tears with the back of my hand and stared across at him with a look of defiance. "Are you ready to arrest the man responsible?" I demanded. "Of course." He took another swig from his bottle. "But, your cooperation is needed." "I don't understand." He nodded. "I know this must be new to you, my brother, but this is Lagos, and investigations of this nature take time, energy, and more importantly, a little bit of..." He rubbed his thumb against his index finger and middle fingers in a universal gesture of hard cash. "Finance." "Finance? It costs money to investigate these things, my brother." He shrugged matter-of-factly. "As I said before, this is..." "Lagos," I interrupted. "Heard it a million times already." He leaned forward, covertly lowering his voice. "Listen, my brother. For the right price, I will not only find the man who committed this atrocity, but make sure he pays in the worst way possible." Reclining back into his seat, he smiled. "That's why they call me Rambo." "Rambo?" "Like Stallone, only 100 times more dangerous." I went quiet for a moment. "Suppose I made this easier for you." He leaned forward once again, the smile returning to his face. What do you have? I reached into the back pocket of my jeans, produced a folded piece of paper with the name and address I'd been given, and placed it on the table. Gazing down at the paper with the look of someone who had just been insulted, Balogun straightened up in his chair. He gestured to the paper with an open hand. What is this? He demanded. Information on the identity of the driver. He reached across, picked up the paper and unfolded it. Then he stared at the details with a blank expression on his face. Where did you get this? Not at liberty to say, I'm afraid. He flattened the paper back onto the table and continued to stare at it. How sure are you about this? Sure enough. He looked up at me. The smile returned to his face, only this time there was a bitter edge to it. You can forget the money, he said. I'll do this one for nothing. I looked at him, searching his face for some indication of a catch, but couldn't find one. How? When? I stuttered. We will bring him in tomorrow. You and your team? No. He jabbed a finger in my direction and then pointed back to himself. You and me. Bewildered, I stared at him. I'm not sure I understand. He didn't answer me, his attention returning to the piece of paper which he picked up once again. Then, as though delivering a battle cry, he yelled out the name written on it. Simon Juku. His eyes shot in my direction. Every day for the thief, one day for the owner. I stared back at him and couldn't help thinking that after his earlier spiel about having me finance the investigation, reciting a proverb about every crook receiving his comeuppance was a definite case of the proverbial pot calling the kettle black. You want me to come with you? I asked. Of course, he said. Come and witness why they call me Rambo. He rose up from the chair. Where are you staying? A hotel, the other side of town. Perfect. You give me the details and I'll pick you up. What time? 6 o'clock. Evening? Morning. He flashed the paper at me and pointed to a crucial part of the address which read, City of Abuja. It will take some time for us to reach there, he said. I sprung to my feet, instantly feeling vindicated and in control. Let's do it, I roared.